Something is quietly building in the global economy right now, and most people are completely unaware of it. While headlines focus on technology, politics, and stock markets, a far more immediate pressure is forming beneath the surface of daily life: food. By 2026, the price of basic meals could rise in ways that feel sudden, even though the warning signs have been visible for years. Climate instability is disrupting harvests across continents. Fertilizer and energy costs are reshaping the economics of farming. Trade restrictions are tightening global supply lines, and together, these forces are pushing the world toward a point where food is no longer just expensive, it becomes unpredictable.
This is not about temporary inflation or seasonal price changes. It is about a structural shift in how food is produced, transported, and accessed. When the system that feeds billions of people starts to weaken at multiple points at once, even small disruptions can trigger large economic reactions. The real danger is not just higher prices, it is volatility. Moments where markets move faster than people can adapt, where supply gaps appear without warning, and where everyday essentials become harder to afford across entire regions. Understanding what is coming is no longer optional. It is the difference between preparation and shock, between stability and struggle in an increasingly uncertain global food system.
The world is standing at the edge of another major economic shock, and this time it is centered on something every human being cannot escape: food. From rice in Lagos markets to wheat in global supermarkets, prices are showing early signs of pressure that could escalate into a full-blown crisis by 2026. This is not speculation. It is a convergence of climate disruption, geopolitical tension, supply chain fragility, and rising production costs that are quietly building underneath global attention. Over the past few years, food systems have been stretched to their limits. Extreme weather events have damaged harvests across key agricultural regions. Floods in Asia, droughts in parts of Africa, and heat waves in Europe have reduced yields of essential crops. At the same time, fertilizer shortages and energy price fluctuations have made farming more expensive than ever before. Farmers are producing less while spending more, and that imbalance is beginning to reflect in market prices.
Another hidden pressure point is global conflict and trade instability. When major exporting countries restrict food exports to protect domestic supply, global markets tighten immediately. This creates ripple effects that hit import-dependent nations the hardest. For countries already battling inflation, currency depreciation, and unemployment, rising food prices are not just an economic issue, but a survival challenge. In addition, transportation and logistics costs remain unstable. Shipping disruptions, fuel price volatility, and aging infrastructure in many regions have made it more expensive to move food from farms to cities. Even when production is sufficient, distribution bottlenecks can still create artificial scarcity in local markets.
What makes the situation more concerning is timing. By 2026, several overlapping cycles are expected to peak simultaneously. Debt pressures in developing economies, climate-related agricultural stress, and global energy transitions could all converge into a perfect storm. Economists warn that food inflation often arrives late in economic cycles, but when it does, it is both rapid and widespread. For ordinary people, this means one thing: the cost of basic survival may rise faster than income. Staple foods like grains, oils, and vegetables could become significantly more expensive, forcing households to adjust consumption patterns, reduce variety, or seek cheaper alternatives. Understanding these signals early is critical. The coming sections will break down the key drivers behind this potential crisis, how it could unfold step by step, and what it means for individuals, businesses, and governments worldwide.
Governments are already beginning to monitor food inflation indicators more closely, but policy responses often lag behind real market conditions. If current trends continue, price controls and subsidies may become more common, yet these measures rarely solve underlying supply shortages. Instead, they often delay adjustment and increase fiscal pressure. Consumers, meanwhile, may not notice early warnings until supermarket prices shift suddenly, making the crisis feel abrupt even though it has been building for years in the background. Awareness, therefore, becomes a critical form of preparation in uncertain times across global food supply chain systems.
One of the most powerful drivers of the coming food crisis is climate instability. Agriculture is no longer operating under predictable weather patterns. Instead, farmers across the world are dealing with erratic rainfall, prolonged droughts, and destructive floods that can wipe out entire growing seasons in a matter of days. In regions that depend heavily on rain-fed agriculture, even small changes in temperature or precipitation can determine whether harvests succeed or fail. Staple crops like maize, rice, and wheat are particularly sensitive to heat stress during critical growth stages. When temperatures exceed optimal ranges, yields decline sharply, and in some cases, crops fail entirely.
Water scarcity is also becoming a major constraint. Rivers that once provided reliable irrigation are shrinking due to overuse, melting glaciers, and shifting rainfall patterns. Groundwater reserves are being depleted faster than they can naturally replenish. This creates long-term risks for food production systems that depend on intensive irrigation. Soil degradation is another silent crisis. Decades of over-farming, deforestation, and chemical-intensive agriculture have reduced soil fertility in many regions. As soil quality declines, farmers must use more fertilizers to maintain output, which increases production costs and environmental damage at the same time. At the global level, climate-related disruptions are no longer isolated events. They are becoming synchronized. Multiple major food-producing regions are now experiencing stress at the same time, reducing the ability of global markets to compensate through trade. When one region fails, others are expected to fill the gap, but that safety net is weakening.
This situation is further complicated by rising energy costs, which directly affect fertilizer production. Natural gas is a key input in nitrogen-based fertilizers, and any disruption in energy markets quickly translates into higher food production costs. Farmers then face a difficult choice: absorb the cost or reduce usage, both of which impact yields. The result is a structural tightening of global food supply. It is not just about temporary shortages, it is about a long-term shift in the baseline cost of producing food. Even in years without extreme weather events, the underlying system is becoming more expensive and less efficient. As 2026 approaches, the accumulation of these climate-related pressures is expected to intensify. Without significant adaptation in farming methods, irrigation infrastructure, and crop resilience, the gap between food demand and supply may continue to widen, setting the stage for persistent price increases across global markets.
Governments and agricultural institutions are beginning to invest in climate-smart farming techniques, such as drought-resistant seeds, precision irrigation, and regenerative agriculture. However, adoption remains uneven, especially in developing regions where financing and infrastructure are limited. This creates a widening gap between advanced agricultural economies and vulnerable subsistence farming systems. Additionally, insurance markets for crops are becoming more strained as climate risks become harder to predict. If these trends continue, global food systems may shift from stability to chronic volatility, where price spikes become more frequent and less predictable than in previous decades, affecting both urban consumers and rural producers worldwide over time. Beyond climate and environmental pressures, geopolitics is playing an increasingly central role in shaping global food security. Food has become a strategic asset, and many countries are now treating agricultural exports as tools of political leverage rather than purely economic trade. When major grain exporting nations impose export restrictions, global markets react almost instantly.
These decisions are often made to protect domestic populations from inflation and shortages, but they create immediate pressure on importing countries that rely heavily on external supply chains. The result is sudden price spikes that ripple across continents. Trade wars and sanctions also contribute to instability. When countries restrict access to critical inputs such as fertilizers, seeds, or energy, agricultural productivity in affected regions declines. This is especially important because modern agriculture is highly dependent on global supply chains for efficiency and scale. Another key factor is conflict in agriculturally important regions. Wars disrupt farming activities, destroy infrastructure, and displace rural populations. Even when conflict does not directly target farmland, the surrounding instability can prevent planting and harvesting cycles from functioning normally. Shipping routes and global logistics corridors are also vulnerable to geopolitical tension. Narrow choke points, such as canals and straits, can become bottlenecks if disrupted, increasing transportation costs and delaying food delivery. These delays may not always reduce total global supply, but they reduce local availability, which still drives up prices. Fertilizer markets are particularly sensitive to geopolitical shifts. A small number of countries dominate the production of key fertilizer components, meaning any disruption in those regions can have outsized global effects. When fertilizer prices rise, farmers worldwide face higher input costs, which eventually translate into higher food prices for consumers. In many ways, food systems are now deeply interconnected with global power structures. This means that food inflation is no longer just an agricultural issue. It is also a geopolitical outcome shaped by decisions made at the highest levels of government. As 2026 approaches, analysts warn that the combination of trade restrictions, regional conflict, and supply chain fragmentation could amplify existing vulnerabilities. Even if production levels remain stable in some regions, global distribution inefficiencies may still create localized scarcity and price volatility. Another emerging dynamic is strategic food stockpiling by governments and large institutions. In anticipation of potential shortages, some countries are increasing their national reserves of staple grains and essential commodities. While this can provide short-term security domestically, it reduces the volume available on international markets, further tightening global supply. At the same time, private traders often respond to uncertainty by speculating on commodity prices, which can amplify volatility beyond what physical shortages alone would justify. Financial markets, therefore, play a significant role in accelerating price movements. Currency fluctuations in developing economies also worsen import costs, making food even less affordable for vulnerable populations. Together, these forces create a feedback loop where fear of shortages contributes directly to real shortages in the marketplace, ultimately reinforcing inflationary pressure across both developed and emerging economies alike over extended periods in unpredictable economic cycles globally. Even when food is produced in sufficient quantities, getting it from farms to consumers remains a complex and fragile process. Global food supply chains rely on a tightly coordinated network of transportation systems, storage facilities, processing plants, and retail distribution channels. When any part of this network fails, the effects can be felt immediately in local markets. One of the major vulnerabilities in the system is transportation cost volatility. Fuel prices directly influence the cost of moving food across long distances. When energy prices rise, trucking, shipping, and air freight become more expensive, and these costs are eventually passed on to consumers through higher food prices. Port congestion and shipping delays have also become more common in recent years.
Large volumes of agricultural goods must pass through a limited number of global shipping hubs, and any disruption can create significant backlogs. These delays do not necessarily reduce global supply, but they reduce efficiency, which increases costs and creates temporary shortages in specific regions.
Labor shortages are another growing concern. Agriculture and food logistics depend heavily on human labor at multiple stages, from planting and harvesting to packaging and distribution. In many regions, fewer workers are entering these sectors due to low wages, harsh working conditions, and urban migration. This creates bottlenecks that reduce overall system productivity. Cold storage and food preservation infrastructure are also unevenly distributed. In developed economies, advanced refrigeration systems help reduce waste and stabilize supply. However, in many developing regions, lack of proper storage leads to significant post-harvest losses. This means that even when crops are successfully grown, a portion never reaches the market. Digital infrastructure plays an increasingly important role as well. Modern supply chains rely on data systems to track inventory, forecast demand, and optimize logistics. However, disruptions in digital networks or cybersecurity threats can also impact food distribution efficiency. The economic consequences of a global food price surge extend far beyond grocery bills. Food inflation has historically been one of the most sensitive drivers of overall inflation, especially in developing economies, where households spend a large share of their income on basic necessities. When food prices rise sharply, central banks often face difficult policy choices. Raising interest rates can help control inflation, but it may also slow economic growth and increase unemployment. On the other hand, failing to act can allow inflation to spiral, eroding purchasing power and destabilizing currencies. For households, the impact is immediate and unavoidable. Unlike other forms of inflation that may be delayed or absorbed through savings, food price increases affect daily survival. Families are forced to make difficult trade-offs, reducing dietary diversity, cutting discretionary spending, or relying on lower quality substitutes.
In many emerging markets, currency depreciation amplifies the problem. Since a significant portion of food is imported, weaker currencies make essential goods more expensive, even if global prices remain stable. This creates a double burden of international price increases and local currency weakness. Small businesses are also affected. Restaurants, food vendors, and retailers often operate on thin margins, and sudden increases in input costs can force them to raise prices or reduce portions. This can lead to reduced demand and lower revenues, creating a cycle of economic pressure throughout the food service industry. Governments may attempt to intervene through subsidies, price controls, or import adjustments. However, these policies often come with fiscal costs and may distort market signals. In some cases, they provide temporary relief but fail to address structural supply issues.
Over time, persistent food inflation can reshape consumer behavior and economic expectations. People begin to adjust their spending patterns permanently, prioritizing the essentials over non-essential goods. This shift can slow broader economic growth and alter long-term development trajectories. Another significant consequence is the widening gap between income groups. Lower-income households spend a disproportionate share of their earnings on food, meaning they are hit hardest by price increases. This can accelerate poverty rates and deepen existing inequality within societies. In extreme cases, prolonged food inflation can contribute to social unrest, protests, and political instability, particularly in regions where social safety nets are weak. Migration pressures may also increase as people move in search of more affordable living conditions and better access to basic necessities. Informal economies tend to expand under such conditions as individuals seek alternative income sources outside formal employment structures. Governments face growing fiscal strain as they attempt to balance subsidies, welfare programs, and debt obligations simultaneously. International aid organizations may also experience higher demand for food assistance programs, stretching global humanitarian capacity. Ultimately, food inflation is not just an economic indicator. It becomes a multi-dimensional stress test for societies, governments, and institutions across the world, across both national and household economic levels globally overall.
Looking ahead to 2026, the global food system stands at a critical turning point. The convergence of climate instability, geopolitical tension, supply chain fragility, and economic pressure suggests that food prices may not simply rise temporarily, but could enter a new phase of sustained volatility. However, the future is not predetermined. While the risks are significant, there are also clear pathways for mitigation. Investments in sustainable agriculture, improved infrastructure, and resilient supply chains can reduce the severity of potential disruptions. Governments, private sector actors, and international organizations all have roles to play in strengthening global food security. One of the most important steps is early warning systems. By improving data collection and forecasting capabilities, it becomes possible to identify supply shocks before they fully materialize. This allows policymakers to respond proactively rather than reactively, reducing the likelihood of sudden crises.
Public awareness is also crucial. When individuals understand the structural forces behind food price increases, they are better able to adapt their consumption patterns and financial planning. Education and transparency can help reduce panic-driven behaviors that often worsen market instability. At the same time, long-term solutions must focus on addressing root causes rather than symptoms. This includes investing in climate adaptation for agriculture, reducing dependence on fragile supply routes, and supporting farmers with modern tools and technology. The coming years will test the resilience of global systems in unprecedented ways. Food security will no longer be a background issue. It will be central to economic stability, political decision-making, and social well-being. Whether the world experiences a severe food crisis or successfully navigates these challenges will depend on choices made today. Preparation, coordination, and foresight will determine whether 2026 becomes a year of crisis or a turning point toward greater stability.
We must also consider the role of technological innovation in reshaping agricultural productivity. Advances in biotechnology, precision farming, and climate modeling are already beginning to transform how food is produced and distributed. However, access to these technologies remains uneven across regions, creating disparities in productivity and resilience. Without equitable access, the benefits of innovation may be concentrated in already developed economies, leaving vulnerable regions further behind. International cooperation will therefore be essential in ensuring that technological progress contributes to global food security rather than widening existing gaps. Investment in education, rural development, and infrastructure will also play a critical role in building long-term resilience across agricultural systems. At the same time, individuals and communities can take practical steps to reduce vulnerability. Diversifying food sources, supporting local agriculture, and improving storage practices can all help reduce the impact of global shocks at the local level. Financial planning that accounts for inflationary pressures can also improve household resilience. On a broader scale, strengthening regional trade agreements and reducing dependency on single import sources can help stabilize supply chains. Ultimately, the challenge of food security requires coordinated action across all levels of society, from farmers and policymakers to consumers. The decisions made in the present will shape the stability of food systems for decades to come.
The coming food crisis is not a single event. It is a chain reaction of interconnected pressures that have been building for years. Climate stress is reducing agricultural reliability. Geopolitical tensions are fragmenting trade routes. Supply chains are becoming more fragile under economic strain. And all of this is happening while global demand continues to rise. By 2026, these forces may not just increase food prices, they may redefine how stability itself is measured in the global economy. What once felt predictable, weekly groceries, stable staple prices, reliable imports, could become increasingly variable and dependent on external shocks. But awareness changes outcomes. Systems only collapse when pressure is ignored, not when it is understood. Governments can adapt policies.
Farmers can shift methods,
Supply chains can be redesigned, and individuals can make informed decisions that reduce exposure to volatility. The future of food security will depend on how early these signals are taken seriously. If the world responds proactively, the worst outcomes can be softened. If not, the system will continue to tighten until shortages and price spikes become more frequent realities. What happens next will not be determined by one cause, but by how multiple risks are managed together. And in that sense, the coming years are not just about surviving higher prices. They are about building resilience before the pressure fully arrives.